In this video, we'll take a look at how to use Gaia to generate seamless and high-resolution tileable cliff and rock textures for game or film environments, like this rock cliff tileable seen here. We'll start off with a blank graph, and we're going to begin by creating a igneous node. And this is going to give us some good details for something that's similar to rock or some sort of rough surface that might be used to make rock. If we take a look at what the igneous node is going to give us, it'll give us something like this, but we can start changing some settings. I'm going to go on this node and we have the scale, power, and seed. I'm going to make the power much stronger, maybe something like 1.95 or 2. And then scale, I think 3 might be okay. Let's take a look at what we get. But we're just looking to get some larger structures, larger shapes that might give us some more interesting patterns. I think something like this is pretty cool, but we can change the seed and try other variations later on as well. Now, to make this into more of a rocky kind of cliff-like surface, even if we rotate around and just look at it, it's not very steep. There's not that much variation in it in terms of angle and slope. So what we're going to do is create 2 slope noises. I'm going to drag in 2 of these slope noise nodes, and on these slope noise nodes, I'm going to use the igneous node as the thing that is driving them. So I'm going to connect them both to that igneous node. And by doing that, it'll impact how the slope noise is generated. And on each one of these slope noise nodes, I'm going to set them to be stratified. And you'll see what that will give me if I preview this node here by pressing F. It turns what we had before into something like this, where it feels much more rocky and rough. So if I go to this other slope noise node, this is what it was originally. We add stratified, it will make it much more rough. Now, what I'm going to do here is if we preview both these slope noise nodes, the first one, second one, they're both facing the same direction. I'm going to make the second one face 180 degrees the other way, so it's the opposite direction. So I end up getting one slope noise like this, one slope noise like this. And we can change some settings on these slope noises as well. Maybe they're a bit too strong. So maybe this scale I'm going to bring down a bit. I'm just going to put these to less scale and more displacement. I'm just going to put the scale to 50 and the displacement to 0.25. And I'm going to do that for both of them, but you can really just play around with these options and see what works best. But that's what I'm going to start with. And if we do that, we see the result. It'll take a little bit of time to generate. What do we got? Okay, more intense, some bigger structures. Great. Now what we're going to do to make this into a single surface instead of these 2 different nodes is we're going to combine them together. So I'm going to go in here and drag out a combine node, and I'll combine both the slope noise nodes with the blend. And I'm going to make it exactly 50%. So it's blending half and half. And that's what the default blend or combined does. Default combined is set to blend with 50%. And if we preview that, it kind of combines both those slope noises into one surface now that is fairly interesting and fairly detailed. Now, since we're treating this surface to be a texture, we're looking at it as if this was the side of it. And if we're making something like a rock wall or a cliff wall, we might want some vertical structuring or detailing on here. And that might be something a bit tough to do. And there's a little bit of a trick that I've used that really helps out when creating those kind of vertical details in Gaia to generate these landscape or organic textures. And that is going to be to use a apex node. So if I take this combination of our slope noises and I go in here and I grab a apex node, what it's going to do is it's going to stretch the surface, or I'll be able to change it to some settings that will stretch the surface. So if I connect this up and I preview that apex node, We'll have some options here. By default, it's set to distance. I'm going to change it to slant, and we'll have some options for A and B. Now, we'll have to play around with these, but I think if I change A, be a little bit lower, and then B to be even lower than A, we start to get these vertical lines kind of showing up. And what I can do, I'll turn on mirror edges, so it just copies around the edges. That might help later on and stretch it a little bit more. That gives us some nice vertical details, but the problem with this is it feels too consistent. They're just straight lines. So a trick that I've used is on this apex node, I'll go down here to these extra options that you can apply to the node, and I'll make use of these quite a bit. And I'm going to open this up here, and I'm going to change it to this one here, which is like displace, but it kind of adds a little bit of a wiggle or wobble. And I'm going to change the intensity pretty high, maybe 35. Scale, you might have to play around with it, but I'm going to make a pretty low scale. You can see what it's doing, wobbling it. But if I make the scale really low, and I have the displace fairly high, and then on top of that, we add a log scaling. It's going to intensify these patterns. And what we end up with is some nice, more organic vertical breakup that doesn't damage the look too much. Like, it doesn't feel too straight or too perfect. It feels a little bit more organic. And you could vary this up. I could even change the seed here to get something that is a little bit different if I'm not happy with it, or change the scale. But for the most part, that gives us some nice detailing. And you might not see much of the detailing right now, but if I were to change this to 1K resolution preview instead of half K or 512, you're going to notice there's quite a bit of detail that get added from that displaced modifier onto these stretched lines now. So this is what we end up with, and that's pretty cool. That gives us some nice structural detail for the side of a cliff face. Now what's next? Well, we lost all of our original detail. If I go back to the combine, there's a lot of detail there that's gone now because we've stretched it and made it wobbly. So we want to get that back. So what I'm going to do next is add another combine. I'll combine this apex node with our old combine node. So kind of getting the best from both of those details. So I'll take the apex node into our new combine, and then also connect that to our old combine node. And I'm not going to blend this. I'm going to previous combine node. I'm going to add it. So I'll add the details on top, and I'll add it with 100%. So now we get our details plus those vertical wobbly lines, which starts to give us a really interesting looking surface. Now on top of this, we have to start adding some more finer details. So I'm going to create a rocky node, which is just going to give us some nice rock details. So I'm going to go in here and find there's a rocky node. I'll drag it into here and give that a minute to generate. Usually when adding nodes and stuff, sometimes make it quicker. I'll click on this little button down here that will suspend processing, and it might just be quicker to connect things up. But in this case, I'll just let it run. Now, if we preview this rocky node just by itself, I'll press F on it. We'll see what it's doing. And it gives us something like that, which is cool, but I want bigger structures and more broad structures as well. I don't want to focus on too many small details. Otherwise, everything just starts to look like noise. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify this rocky node. The size, I'm going to go pretty low, maybe 20%. Amount of small rocks, stay away from having too many small rocks in this case. So maybe I'll set that to something like 10 or 15% instead of the default of 50. So when I'm changing these settings and I know what I want to change, I might just click this button down here to suspend the updating, to suspend the processing, and then change those settings and then resume it. So 20, and then for small rocks, I'll do something like, sure, 12. Breakage, I'll go fairly low, maybe 13%. Roughness, very low, maybe 3% or 0. It wouldn't really matter at that point, I think. And then jitter, maybe 25%. And for relief, I'm going to change it to stratified because I think they'll add some additional breakup and detail and maybe turn erosion on. So I'm going to go in here and grab a combine, pop it in here. I'll combine our old combine node that we had before, and then also combine it with our new rocky texture that we have now, rocky height. And I'll preview this combine. On this combine, I'm just going to set it to add again. We'll probably not want to add too much because it'll become too far up and too high up. So we can bring this ratio down maybe to 40% or something. But at this point, I usually like getting things to be pretty extreme. And to do that, like on our rocky pattern here, if we want to make it stronger details, we could add a log option here, and that pushes it up really high like this. And then if we add that on top, well, then it's going to have much more detail in there as well. That's not a bad thing to do. In this case, we can add that onto our combine as well. Like maybe I won't add it into Rocky here. I'll add it into when we combine everything together. Then I'll throw a log on there to add some log scaling and adjust it. And you can see in this case, it's making it less intense. So maybe I can add it to both. I can add it to the combine, add it to the Rocky, go back here, log, go back to my old combine over here, just add it to everything to make it more intense. Maybe it's not the best thing to do, but you know what, that one's better without it. But it's just a way to try to get different balancing of all those details. So this is what I end up with. Maybe let's turn the log off and see what happens. Okay, so it's better with it on. Oh, my preview not updating. On, and off. So you might want to play around with it. Here it's being added. And then here looks pretty intense. You can also set this to drop to floor, and it pushes everything down to the zero space. So when you add it, it'll be more detailed. That's something that's worth doing as well, because when you add these nodes or change them, the plane starts going higher and higher. So not a bad idea to click drop to floor after a bunch of operations. So when you do add it together, it maintains similar balance where it's all dropped to the floor. And this is what I'm looking for. Very intense details, crazy, looks too much to be like a rock wall, but that's totally fine because this is what I want. And then at this point, I can add a clamp on this combine node and clamp the max amount and make that as intense or as flat as I want it and pull it back down to something like that. Maybe even a little bit less. So that's giving me something that's kind of interesting. That's kind of what I want for my rock wall. So now to make this seamlessly tile, we're just going to add a seamless node into here. So we're going to scroll on down. Maybe I'll make this a bit wider here. There it is, seamless. I'll drag it in and we'll connect our combine node to the seamless node and preview it. Now it's a little bit more tricky with these kind of shapes. If I preview that seamless node and click toggle seamless preview, you can see the tiling is quite noticeable. So the edge is how far it branches out, and then the shift X and Y is kind of where it's sampling to fill in those kind of feathered patterns from the edge of the texture. And at like looking at this, I'm able to get rid of some of the edges a bit, but that center part is what's bothering me, that line that's going directly down. So maybe I have to take a step back to my igneous node at the very beginning. Maybe this pattern is just not working well. So go in here and choose a different seed and let it rebuild and see what I get. So I might have to play around with it, but I've changed the seed a couple times now, and this looks a little bit better. So let's see what the end result looks like now with that. And if I preview the seamless, it'll take a little bit of time to generate because it's going to have to go through all those steps again. And at this stage, I know I'm working at 1K resolution. Might be worth working at half K resolution until you get all the shaping and the bigger structures blocked in, and then you can switch it to higher resolution. But this maybe works a little bit better. I don't get that line anymore. This little lump here in the center, I'm not really liking that much, so maybe I'll change these around a little bit and try to get rid of that. And that's actually not too bad. It's going to be impossible to get rid of the tiling completely. Like I can still recognize features being tiled, but as long as it's better or something that's not totally noticeable, it should work. So you might want to play around with this a bit more, but I think I'm going to leave it here. I'm kind of happy with this. Maybe I can overlap it a bit more. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it's really just something that we can always worry about later. But that's starting to look better, so I won't tile it now. This is what we have. We've done our seamless tiling for now. Now the next thing, which is coloring this, we're adding our diffuse and all that to give it some color map. It's very tricky when dealing with these detailed shapes because you already get some good shadowing in the software, especially if you change your light source to be really hard angled at the edge here. You start to get all this shadowing, which looks really good, and you trick yourself into thinking you've made a better color map than you've really have had. So what I usually do is I take my light and I put it directly above the surface. So on the lighting here, I'll put it right in the center. So it's pretty much front lit, and that looks horrible, but that's what I want. That way I'm not tricking myself when I do the coloring. So I'm going to create a couple nodes to start with. I'm going to suspend the processing so I could create these fairly fast. I'm going to start with a couple nodes that will give us some details. The details that we're after are things that are going to be useful for like a cliff wall. So one thing that would be useful is possibly having something like soil, some kind of drips or patterns flowing down it. So I'm going to grab a soil node. I'm also going to grab a curvature node so we can filter out kind of edges and angles to produce a mask. And then in addition to curvature and soil, I'm also going to add a occlusion node, which is going to give us areas that are occluded or kind of more in crevices, and other areas that are not so occluded. And that's going to give me some useful information. So I'm going to connect all those to the seamless node. And after connecting all those, I am just going to nicely lay them out over here. So we have some space to work with and that things look structured. And we're going to preview what each one of these are doing. We're going to change settings on them. So I'm going to set my resolution just to half K resolution because it's going to be faster to preview this stuff. And then later I'll change it back. So I'll unsuspend the engine and I'll let that generate and we'll preview our occlusion node. So this is what I'm getting with occlusion. I'm going to start changing some settings here. Pass 1, I'm going to put it up a bit higher. For pass 2, I'm going to max it out. I'll leave the other ones at default, but this is going to give me some bigger chunks kind of occluded here with darker values. And then on top of this, I'm going to go down here and I'll add a log scaling to the node as well as a invert. And I'm going to get something like this, which looks pretty cool. It's some nice kind of broken up areas of this rock. And then the soil node, I'm going to preview that next. So I'll preview the soil node. Soil node, we're looking for a bunch of little smaller details and streams and kind of little drips and things. This kind of works, but I'm going to set it to graded. And I'm also going to add log scaling to it. And that's going to give us much brighter, much more finer details. So if we take a look at the result after it's generated, okay, now we get all these details. Great. And then curvature, I'm going to use that to get the really fine details. So curvature already gives me something quite good like this. I'm going to set the minimum to 0, maximum maybe to 25%. Oh, I set minimum to 1, but that's okay. And then fall off, I'll make really high. And we get small details plus some other details as well. Maybe I'll bring the fall off down a little bit less. And curvature type, horizontal is fine. And that should be okay. So between having these 3 different kind of patterns, I'll kind of create a super pattern out of using all of them together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my curvature node into the mask of the soil node, and the soil node into the mask of the occlusion node. And then I'm going to preview the occlusion node. So that's kind of everything all combined. And we're going to see the result. And here it is. Looks kind of interesting. Now at half K resolution, we're not really seeing all the details that we're getting here from doing this. So I'm going to swap this to 2K resolution, and then we'll take a look at what we're actually getting here with this mask. So here it is at 2K resolution, and you can see all the detail we're really getting. We're getting all these very interesting shapes and patterns, and that's going to be useful to make these surfaces look really rocky. So we get a really interesting mask that would be hard to get, and we do this by combining different nodes to produce kind of like a super mask or some sort of map that has a lot of detail. And now what we're going to do is apply color to that. So I'm just going to drag in a sat map. Now for the sat map, again, there's no real specialty to getting this working the way you want. It's really just trial and error. So I'm going to view the sat map. Actually pretty good, this one. That's pretty cool. But we can see what we got. I'm going to go to Rocky. It's number 323. But maybe I'll scroll through here. See just anything that catches my eye. Maybe up here I'll go to the beginning of it. Some ones that are more kind of neutral toned. And just scroll through here and see maybe this 56. How does that look? Not bad. About 59. Okay, that one's looking pretty good. So maybe we can play around with this a bit. Add a bit of a jitter, add some input clarity. It'll make it a little bit more contrasty. And then maybe just play around with the bias a bit and see what we can get. Just shift it along till I get some nice details. So I like this. I like how we're getting some of these little cracks and things a little bit brighter. So maybe I'll stick with that and go from there. So that's not too bad. I'm going to start off with that. And then what we can do is start creating some other pattern to blend with this, and some other color to blend with this. So to get a more interesting pattern that I can blend with this, I don't want to use the same masks here. I'm going to use something a little bit different. I'm going to use velocity. And that will kind of give us, it's meant to give rain falling on a surface and where it flows from what it seems like. But I'm going to use it to create some very nice edge details on these rocks. So I'm going to go to this velocity node. I'm going to preview it. We have a bunch of settings here. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if you have a different shape terrain, all these settings are going to give you a different mask or different result because they are based on that. But try changing things up quite a bit. I've played around with some of these values here, but putting the duration really low in this case gives me some really nice rock details. And you're going to see that pop up in a second. Like all this stuff, these edges, I'm starting to get some of those lines and things. So these have a big impact. Changing duration, changing the rain amount as well. Those two things are going to give you a pretty drastic change on your end result. And as long as you're getting a good pattern that pulls out some additional details, that's what really matters. So if I put my duration really low and I bring down the rain a little bit, maybe even bring down the velocity a little bit, and I take a look at what I'm going to get, I get all these bigger structures here. Maybe I turn invert off, and I just kind of vary and see what works. Maybe this is pretty good. If I add a log on there, how does that look? Too bright? Maybe I'll stick with this, but it's going to look different for you unless you're using the exact same seed numbers. So the idea is get good patterns, get good breakups. That's what you're looking for. And this is kind of interesting. So I'm going to stick with this. I could adjust this to make it darker, which might be a little bit better, or play around with these a bit more, but I'm going to see what happens. So the next thing I'm going to do is now take this velocity node and use it as a way to blend two sat maps together. One sat map is the coloring and texturing we already have here from our previous mask that we made. The next sat map that we're going to create is going to be the exact same thing. So let's take a look at this one first. Take a little minute to load here. There it is. I'm going to copy and paste that, connect it up exactly the same, but just change the type of pattern that we're using. So instead of having these colors and this gradient, I'm going to go find some other gradient that also works. And maybe I leave it to be exactly the same one we have here, but I go into the post-processing, change the hue, saturation, luminance, and make it a bit darker. So give it some darker values, like that. And then what I do is I'll combine those. And I'm just doing this fairly quickly here. I'm not bothering trying to dial anything in to look the best. That's something that you can kind of do. So even the rock I'm creating now is probably mediocre compared to what you'd be able to do if you spend a little bit of time on it. But I'm going to combine both these together. How am I going to combine it? A blend. I'll put the ratio up to 100 or maybe even 80 or 95%. And I'm blending those two to give us something like that. And that works. That adds some detail to it. Now that we have that, maybe we can add one more thing to pull some extra details out of here. And that's going to be an angle node. So I got my velocity. Next, what I'm going to do is create angle, connect that up. I'm going to go here and connect angle. And that's going to give me, if I preview it, a sharp angle. I'm going to set that angle to be pretty much top down, almost like surfaces that would get exposed to rain, and then surfaces that don't get exposed to rain or weathering. So I'm going to take that angle node, and on that angle node, I can change this azimuth to 180 maybe, set the max, maybe 50. That's kind of nice. And I'm going to use that in the mask of our velocity node. And then if I view the velocity node, I'm going to mask away parts, bring in some more of those darker values, and give us something interesting like this. And now that's being used to blend those two colors together, giving us more detail, giving us something like this. And then finally, after doing that, we can start playing around with these and seeing what works, or even combining it again. So what I'm going to do in this case maybe is try one other thing where I'll take another combine node and combine this current one with a map to add some even more details on top. We'll take what we currently have here, and then what I'm going to do, maybe instead of using this angle node into velocity, because that's giving us something like that, we kind of already have those details here in angle, not that much of a difference. Instead, I'm going to add a rock map, which is useful for getting smaller details. So I'm going to go in here and grab a rock map node, connect that to seamless, or my surface. I'm going to view that rock map node, and we'll be able to, it gives us a lot of detail. We're going to be able to change the coverage and the density. So maybe I'm going to go really high on the coverage, lower on the density, just so we're not getting too fine details. But we still want, well, maybe a bit higher on the density. That's good. What I'm looking for is getting all these little crevices and cracks. So let's change this up a bit. I'm going to not use my angle node masking my velocity. Instead, I'm going to use that angle node to mask my rock map. So we only get these rocky details in certain areas like this. And then we'll just use our plain old velocity map here that we had before for the coloring breakup. And then I'm going to use this rock map, combining on top of everything we had before. But this time, this combine is just going to add brightness on top with a very low value, maybe something like 10 or 12, and it's adding a little bit of brightness here. Maybe it's an add, maybe we do a screen, maybe we do a subtract. We can play around with these blend modes to see what gives us nice detail into there. We don't want to add like fake shadowing or anything, but just adding a bit of breakup to the surface, like weathering. So I think this add and having it go a little bit more desaturated here actually works pretty well. It might not look like it does right now because we don't have any lighting or shadowing, but it gives us some nice breakup. It's not feeling monotone. We have different ranges of brightness, darkness, and saturation. Now at this point, we can add our normal map in here as well, so we can export a normal map. So if I want to do that, I can just drag a normal map node into here and connect that up to our seamless. There it is, normal map. Connect it. Again, if you're exporting this to a software with a different world axis, you may have to flip Y or flip X. In this case, I'm going to flip Y. There's our normal map. Then I'm going to view our final color. Here it is. Now let's add that lighting back. Remember, I put the lighting top down, so we're not tricking ourselves into having a better looking, it might look like our texture is really better looking than it really is. So we view it without shadowing like this so that we can focus on what we're adding to the actual color. But now that we're done that, let's add our shadowing back, see how it would look. And we start to see, hey, this looks pretty cool with the actual shadowing. So now we can kind of view this with our lighting in different directions and evaluate, is this surface looking the way that we want it to look? And to be honest, there's a couple things I can fix here. This isn't perfect. Maybe some of those little wobbly lines I want to touch up a bit. But this is still pretty cool. And this is only at 2K res. So I'm going to view this at 4K res. I'll give it a bit of time to regenerate, and then we'll take a look at the final result. Now this is what our end result is looking like at 4K resolution. And then here's our whole kind of graph or node structure. And if we look at this close up, there's a lot of really good details in here. And from this point, we can just mark all our nodes for export. Like we'd mark this end combine one for our color, mark our normal map for a normal map, and then our seamless or combine for our height map, depending what we want there. And we can go to the build tab and then write it all out. And usually I write it out at like 8K resolution or 4K resolution and then scale it down to what's needed for your game or your scene, depending if you're rendering it or having it run in real time. But this gives us a really easy way to generate high resolution, organic, ground or rock cliff textures that are seamless in a pretty quick amount of time and really customizable as well. So it works quite good for giving you a nice library of textures or patterns that you can use for your organic environments. If you enjoyed this video, if you learned something new, don't forget to like and press the subscribe button down below. Also check out the Patreon down below in the description. If you are part of the Patreon, you will get access to this PDF that goes over all the steps, but in a little bit more detail, as well as the finished Gaia file for this rocky cliff wall.